A very good evening, everyone. Yes. A very good evening. So nice to see you all here. So nice that a lot of people turned up. Just before I tell you all about what we're going to do this evening, I'm very curious what we have to work with. So are there any people here in the audience tonight who watch a lot of lifestyle content online? Like cooking videos, like cleaning hacks, things about kids, nursing, whatever. Yeah, so quite a lot of people. Okay, quick follow-up question. Do any of these people sometimes get the feeling that there is a slight political undertone in this content that they watch? Okay, not that many, but a few. Okay, for those of you who have no idea why I'm asking these questions tonight, don't worry, it's all going to make sense in a bit. Because tonight we're going to be talking about the women of the far right and their online presence and influence. And to do that, I brought two excellent speakers with me tonight, who are Eviane Leidig and Andrej Zaslove. And Eviane is a consultant and a researcher and the author of the recently written book, The Women of the Far Right. And for her research on this topic, she has spent a lot of time in online far-right spaces, which I'm sure she's going to tell us all about in a second. And Andrej Zaslove is a political scientist at the Radboud University, and his research focuses on political parties, populism, and democracy. We're first going to listen to a lecture of Eviane of roughly 35 minutes, after which I will have a conversation with her and Andrej. And at the end of the program, there is also some time to ask your own questions. So save them for the end. My name is Pam Teunissen. I am the moderator tonight and program developer at Radboud Reflects. And I think that's it for me now. So, Eviane, if you're ready, we're ready for you. Give her a warm applause.
Hello, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. So what I'll be focusing on is a recently published book called The Women of the Far Right, Social Media Influencers and Online Radicalization. So first, I want to start off by talking about what motivated me to write this book. I started writing this book in 2019, around the decline of the so-called alt-right movement in the US and Canada. And what motivated me to want to focus on the women within this movement is that until then, there was a lot of focus being placed on the men within the alt-right, from the media, but also from other scholars as well. And I knew that women played a really significant role, but they seemed to be not being taken very seriously. And so that's why I wanted to understand what was their role, and why was it that they weren't being featured as prominently as the men within the far right. And based on 3 years of immersive digital ethnographic research, I found that far-right women are playing key roles, so not a singular role, but roles in the plural, as propagandists, organizers, fundraisers, and entrepreneurs, and I'll show you how they do so in the rest of the slides. In particular, I focus upon North American women, although there are some examples from Europe that I'll share. And these North American women they engage in a political activism, and they're focused in particular on culture war issues. That is social and cultural issues, whether it be things like anti-wokeness or anti-gender ideology, for example. And they hope that by focusing on these culture war issues, they can shift public opinion towards their favor. So they're really trying to push for a shift in public consciousness on these social and cultural issues. And perhaps the biggest takeaway, if you're to leave now, but please don't, but the biggest takeaway is that far-right women play a key function, and that is normalizing and legitimizing far-right ideology for mainstream appeal, and they do this in several different ways. So what do I mean when I call these women influencers? Well, I'm building off of a rich body of literature in which I show how these women are serving as leading online personalities that are shaping and popularizing ideas within the far right. And they also rely on practices derived from influencer culture. By this, I mean when we think about influencers, we tend to think about particular individuals. But there's a rich body of research in media and communication studies that shows how influencers have created their own type of online culture, one that has its own sorts of norms and practices. In other words, these women that I focus on, they display the way they live their politics as an aspirational brand. By that, I mean that these women are merging their political ideology with personal lifestyle into one brand that is easily recognizable by their audiences. And they do so in ways that I describe as using networked intimacy to build and maintain their personal brands so that their followers feel like they know and intimately feel close to these influencers. Now I'll guide you through the examples on the screen. The top example is a screenshot from a YouTube thumbnail of Brittany Zellner, née Pettibone. She's married to the leader of the Austrian branch of the identitarian movement, Martin Zellner. And the title of this video is 3 Reasons Marriage is a Risk and Why We Still Took It. So actually the video is the two of them on their honeymoon. And they're sitting off of the beach on the Mediterranean Sea. They're drinking cafe lattes. And they're talking about how wonderful their wedding was, how many people could come to celebrate, and subsequently how wonderful their ongoing honeymoon is. And they take what is a very personal decision of getting married and wanting to start a family, and they weaponize this as a political act. So in the video, they claim that society is anti-marriage, anti-traditional nuclear family. And so for them, partaking in this act is an act of political resistance, as they claim. Now, I don't know about you, I did not broadcast my honeymoon onto the internet like they did. But they took what was a very personal, very private aspect of their lives and showcased this in line with what they believe to be their political ideology that guides their personal actions. On the bottom left is an Instagram story from the French activist Thijs Descoufon. Thijs used to be a spokesperson for the identitarian movement in France before it was banned by the government in 2021, and she still continues to create content independently. What you see on the bottom left in that Instagram story is she's showing behind-the-scenes editing of an upcoming video that's going to be released on her YouTube channel. You can see that she also includes a countdown sticker there so that her followers will get automatically notified when that video is uploaded onto her YouTube channel. Now, in the past, we've seen brands and use things like countdown stickers in PR and marketing to get audiences excited about forthcoming content that would be released by these brands. But in this case, influencers like Thijs, they are the brand themselves. They're getting the audiences excited about forthcoming content that's going to be released on their channels. And then on the bottom right-hand side, this is an Instagram post by a Canadian influencer named Robin Riley. And she writes in the description, well, it's a before and after selfie of that post. And she writes in the description, glow up. If it could happen to me, it can happen to anyone. Pick one: undereating, in a bad relationship for 7 years, heavy smoker, feeling numb inside, lost. Pick two: eating healthy, married and pregnant, off all drugs, feeling joy and gratitude for my life, saved. At the bottom, she writes, these pics were taken 4 years apart, and it didn't happen overnight. You've got to put in the work for the reward. Be patient with yourself. Deprogramming is a long process. Now, when I started off writing about these women, Instagram was a vastly understudied platform in terms of understanding its potential for radicalization. And on the surface, it doesn't seem like there's anything inherently political about this post, until you start to read into the coded language that Robin is using. So, for example, she uses the term glow up. By raise of hands, how many of you are familiar with this term, glow up? Okay, most people in the audience, that's good. For those who don't know, it's a term that comes from the beauty blogging community, and it signifies a period of personal transformation inside and out to achieve your best self or your most natural self. And used in this context, Robin is using that term glow up as a metaphor for her own radicalization journey. She's also using terms like deprogramming at the bottom to signify deprogramming from liberal indoctrination, is how she puts it. But again, on the surface, this is a story that she has framed about herself, which is one of building self-confidence, of self-improvement. And again, that becomes a euphemism for her radicalization journey. Now, together, all these examples show how these women are using networked intimacy techniques to reach out to their audiences and for their audiences to feel like they can relate to these women. And here, this is where I argue that far-right activists are using influencer practices on social media as a radicalization strategy intentionally. They portray these qualities of seeming to be relatable, accessible, authentic, and responsive to their followers. But we should bear in mind that this is an audience perception. We don't actually know what the day-to-day reality is for these women. It's what they choose to showcase to their followers. But nonetheless, this strategy can still present an opportunity for far-right activists to deliver propaganda on social media towards a legitimizing effect of their political ideology because it is seen as relatable, as authentic. Now, when I started off writing this book, I very quickly turned to a genre of red YouTube videos that I called red pill vlogs. How many of you here are familiar with the term red pilling? Okay. Very engaged audience. So red pill is a term that comes from the film The Matrix, in which the protagonist Neo is offered to take the red pill and be awakened to the truths of society, or take the blue pill and continue to live a life of ignorance and delusion. Now, for the far right, the term the red pill very quickly became a euphemism as the first step of their radicalization journey towards beliefs like anti-feminism, anti-liberalism, and beliefs in conspiracy theories like the Great Replacement, or during COVID, the Great Reset. On the left-hand side, you'll see some screenshots of these red pill vlogs from these women. It's usually the first video or two that you can find on their YouTube channels. It's videos with titles like My Red Pill Journey, or the one below that, Origin Story. I think origin story is an interesting phrase because to me it signals a type of rebirth or reawakening after having been red-pilled. And in these red pill vlogs, these influencers will go deep into their backgrounds and their life histories. So they'll talk about growing up in middle-class families and living in middle-class neighborhoods. They'll talk about going to university and entering corporate jobs after graduation, socializing with friends and colleagues, and living in urban areas, which is quite normal behavior. And then there's a moment in time in which these influencers will describe feeling deeply depressed and unhappy with their life situation. It's this moment in time in which these influencers will attribute feminism for their unhappiness. So they claim that because feminists control mainstream social norms, this unnaturally forces women into the public workplace. And that for these influencers, then traditionalism is seen as the antidote to feminism. Now, what's also quite interesting is after these initial red pill vlogs, these influencers will create a follow-up vlog, as the ones you see on the right-hand side of the screen. Well, they'll talk about losing friends and families after having been red pilled. It's videos with titles like I Lost All My Friends in the Culture War, or the one below that, Red Pilled, Losing Friends. Here they are crying in front of the webcam, talking about the personal pain of losing family and friends after being red pilled. But then they frame it as, I'm just finding my most confident self. I'm finding my most authentic self. And so these narratives of authenticity, of just finding your inner confidence, they mask a hateful ideology and movement. When I started off writing this book, I had assumed that most of these far-right women influencers would be attempting to recruit and radicalize other women into the far-right. But I very quickly found that on YouTube in particular, Instagram less so, and we can talk about why in the Q&A, they had a disproportionate number of male viewers of their content. So they would be purposely creating content for their male followers with titles like The War on Men, as you see there on the top left, or the one next to that, Why These Men Are Doomed to Be Unhappy. And in these videos, they'll talk about how because mainstream society is controlled by feminists, this prohibits men from exercising their, quote, natural biological masculine traits, things like aggression, dominance, and leadership. And that if men join the far right, they can exercise these traits and find a submissive wife. They will also try to bring up controversial talking points, like the video on the bottom left there, in response to figures like Andrew Tate being banned off of mainstream platforms, discussing things like why is he controversial, and then finding particular ways to then explain why they support particular aspects of Andrew Tate's platform, talking about things like the breakdown of gender relations in mainstream society that leads young men to find figures like Tate attractive. And then as I dived more into this world, I was getting recommended things like traditionalist accounts, like the one on the bottom right. This is Madame Europa. It used to be run by the Identitarians before it got shut down, portraying these archetypes of men being protectors and providers, and such as the figure you see there in the photo with the caption, "Europe is the new white." But above all, these women do see their primary role as wives and mothers, and that is very much continuing the legacy of women's roles within the far right. But I wanted to understand, how does that manifest today? And it is through this type of networked intimacy that I brought up earlier. Ashley Matthias calls this phenomenon alt-maternalism, or maternalist logics paired with anti-multiculturalism, white ethno-nationalism, and hate networks. For instance, the top photo is a screenshot from a YouTube channel called Motherland that was founded by two of the women in my study. They founded this channel after discovering that they each had been pregnant for the first time with their child. And a lot of the content that they discuss on this YouTube channel is very stereotypical mommy blogging content. So it's things like prenatal nutrition, breastfeeding tips, diapering tips, etc. But at other times, these conversations can turn toxic very quickly. So for instance, logging into a 2-hour live stream once, I remember how 1 hour into the live stream, one of these women was breastfeeding her newborn son on camera, and then very quickly started talking about their duty to reproduce in order to save the white race. Now, again, on the surface, it seems like it's very typical mommy blogging content until you dive into the content itself and you realize how extreme it can turn in the blink of an eye. On the bottom left-hand side, this is an Instagram story in which Robin writes, "My workspace. I have begun writing a birth prep and intro to motherhood ebook, covering everything from TTC, that means trying to conceive, to breastfeeding. How exciting is that?" And she polls her followers, "Is this something that would be of value to you or someone you know? Yes or no?" And presumably that is her working on that ebook with her son laying next to it. Now, again, women in the far right have in the past written books for other followers of the movement. But what I'm arguing through this type of networked intimacy is how they are actively inviting their audience into the content creation process in ways that we haven't seen before and soliciting their participation in that. And then during the pandemic in particular, there was quite a lot of scientific disinformation that was being spread by these women because they were framed around issues of fertility and of maternalism. For example, in the middle, this is a post from the Dutch influencer Eva Vlaardingbroek, and she writes some of the reasons why I distill my tap water, linking to these scientific articles that show how hormonal birth control levels are being introduced into water supply systems. Interestingly, she does use these two academic journal articles to make her point as to why she then distills her tap water. Again, this is seen as an issue because it is seen as a direct threat to the fertility and to the reproductive ability of women. Or on the right-hand side, as we probably have seen quite a lot during the pandemic, sharing scientific disinformation about the COVID vaccine's effects. In this case, sharing the headline that nearly half of women who took Pfizer COVID trial vaccine experienced a miscarriage. Again, we don't necessarily know why these women did experience a miscarriage, and certainly that is an area to be investigated. But at that time when people were fearful about the vaccine's effects, weaponizing that fear to promote their maternalist narratives about threats to the reproductive ability of women. Now, one thing I did not expect writing this book was actually how many interesting food recipes and cooking tips I gained along the way. And this is all part of understanding these women's roles within the movement. As Cynthia Miller-Idris has written, ideals about food, cooking, and nurturing white families have long intersected with gendered understandings of proper roles as wives and mothers within the far right, and it's part of their propaganda strategy. This was materialized through initiatives like you see on the left-hand side during the recent US presidential election, where there was a subgroup of women who promoted this Make America Healthy Again narrative, as you see there. This is a post from a very popular podcast called Culture Apothecary. In the middle there, this is a photo of actually what looks like to be very delicious avocado toast. Here, Robin writes, "One of my newest pregnancy-related recipes, wild Alaskan salmon caviar on avocado toast." And then she continues to describe the health benefits of salmon caviar as a superfood in terms of the bioavailability of omega-3 fatty acids, folate, iron, and lean protein found in roe, making it the perfect pregnancy recipe. Again, on the surface, doesn't seem to be initially political until you contextualize this post along with Robin's other content, and then you understand that the purpose of posting recipes like this is to prime women's bodies towards optimal fertility and reproductive ability. And then similarly on the right-hand side, This is an Instagram profile of an influencer who is showcasing various homemade organic recipes that she creates, such as homemade granola and drinking raw milk, as well as advice on how to incorporate things like bone marrow into your diet. These posts are clustered in with her joyfully playing with her children, but then it's also interlaced with conspiracy theories, such as that post on the top left saying whatever the government says, do the opposite. So we see quite a lot of focus around alternative health and wellness advice that runs counter to scientific evidence. Because these women are influencers, there's a significant amount of entrepreneurial activity they are engaging in as well. And this ranges from everything to creating content themselves in the form of publishing books, for example, that are widely available through global distributors like Amazon, or it's partnering on affiliate links, such as the photo you see there in the middle by a very popular tradwife named Mrs. Midwest. This is taken from her blog, and here you can shop my life, as she puts it. So there's links to her Amazon storefront in which you can shop her favorite cooking picks, her favorite beauty and skincare products, as well as cleaning items that she uses in the house. And she receives a small commission if you purchase these products using that Amazon affiliate link. I thought this was a very interesting example because in many ways you can literally consume her identity through buying the products that she recommends. For these influencers, there's also a significant amounts of sponsorships and paid product advertising as well, such as the photo in the middle right, in which Robin is showcasing her favorite beef liver supplements and beef organ supplements that she chooses to consume, and there her followers can get a discount code if they purchase these supplements. Oftentimes these products are ideologically motivated companies, so they are part of this broader far-right ecosystem of entrepreneurs in commercial activity. Some of you might pick up on the fact that this supplement company is called Higher Health, or HH for short. When I give this conversation in Germany, people tend to pick up on that fact, and they say this would never be allowed in Germany. Or on the right-hand side, a merchandise company called Forbidden Clothes, which promotes art and apparel for the awakened few, and there you see a rabbit going down the rabbit hole with that emoji next to it. And this company promotes merchandise with conspiratorial claims, such as, for example, a photo of a person with a sheep's head, referring to sheeple, saying underneath that government knows best, so people are sheep blindly following the government's lead. Another t-shirt with the frame, tradition is the new rebellion, and that's portraying a traditional nuclear family unit there. Below that, a shirt called Resist the NWO, the New World Order, referring to this conspiracy theory of tied to the Zionist-occupied government conspiracy theory myth. You might notice a figure there modeling one of the t-shirts. That is, again, Dutch influencer Eva Fladerenbroek, who's partnered with this company to promote its products. So we're seeing a broad, vast array of various entrepreneurial activities that these far-right women influencers are engaging in for monetization efforts. There's a lot on this slide, so I'll break it down for you. But I wanted to also focus in particular on some of the transnational ties that are being cemented by these women. And when we think about transnational ties, it's quite helpful to think about these ties happening through various layers and through different ways and forums. So for example, figures on the left-hand side, like Lauren Southern, who a while back gave a speech at the youth wing of Vlaams Belang, a Flemish far-right political party. Or the photo next to that, more recently, the Dutch influencer Eva Fladerenbroek, who is on a panel in Spain in which she writes, in Spain today to talk about mass migration and what a disaster it has been for European women. We're being sacrificed on the altar of mass migration, and it needs to end now. So participating in these more, say, intellectualizing exercises, whether it be through avenues like political parties, in which we see these women oftentimes legitimizing very extreme ideas in more palatable ways to their audiences. At other times, these women will be more active in creating things like documentaries and producing this type of content, such as what you see on the bottom left, featuring a documentary called Borderless, which documents the effects of the refugee crisis in Europe, and talking about how this is all an orchestrated plot towards achieving the Great Replacement. And then on the top right-hand side, we see figures like Eva Vlaardingbroek. Eva used to be a member of the Forum for Democracy, and she rose to prominence giving a speech against feminism within the party. Soon thereafter, had left and moved to Sweden, where she became a spokesperson for one of the Sweden Democrats' YouTube channels. So that's what you see here on the top right. She hosted a talk show called Let's Talk About It. After living in Sweden for a while, moved back to the Netherlands and was quite active in the forefront of promoting the Dutch farmers' protests, and subsequently has gained quite an international following in terms of appearing on various media channels like Tucker Carlson in the US, as well as channels across Europe, in Germany, in France, Italy, etc. We'll get back to her in a minute. And then during times of consolidation, we will see these women rallying around figures like the images you see on the bottom right-hand side. So this is in response of different influencers to the election of Giorgia Meloni. Robin Riley in Canada saying good morning to based Italians only upon hearing the news of Meloni's election. Thijs de Scuffon there in the middle making a reactionary video to Meloni's election, trying to debunk these talking points, or these claims rather, that Meloni is a fascist. And then Ali Beth Stuckley on the right, an American influencer excited about Meloni's election. However, one of the most important aspects in understanding the transnational ties of these women is ways in which that they can legitimize extreme talking points to mainstream audiences. For example, on the left-hand side, earlier this year, Eva Vlaardingbroek gave a talk at CPAC Hungary, the Conservative Political Action Committee, a US-based organization. Every year they host an annual conference in Hungary. She gave a speech there in which she promoted the Great Replacement theory, and she writes, "Here it is, the full speech I gave at CPAC Hungary that the establishment is currently losing its absolute mind over. I spoke the forbidden truth. The Great Replacement is no longer a theory, it's reality. White Europeans are being replaced in their own countries at an ever-accelerating rate. And it will mean the end of our civilization as we know it if we don't turn things around." Now, apparently within 2 days of posting this video, it had received over 44 million views on Twitter. At that same CPAC Hungary event, she met once again with Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister. And she describes Orban as being one of the very few sane leaders left in Europe. And thank you for your tireless defense of Christian values, national sovereignty, and freedom. Now, the reason why I bring up the fact that these women will often mainstream these much more extreme talking points is that back in 2017, we saw influencers like Lauren Southern on the top right promoting the Great Replacement conspiracy theory. And it was seen to be a rather fringe talking point at that time. But arguably, it's become a much more predominant talking point in the public sphere. And after Eva's speech, Lauren made a reaction video saying, The Great Replacement, can we finally talk about it? Meaning almost 10 years ago, I was being deplatformed for spreading this information, and now we see figures like AFA front and center discussing it openly, and publicly to mainstream audiences. And below that, that is a video by Lauren Chen, also saying Lauren Southern was right. The Great Replacement theory is real. And finally, I want to end by talking about various ways to counter the far right online. There are also offline measures that I'm happy to discuss in the Q&A. But when we think about countering the far right online, we often think about content moderation. And that is a set of practices that relies on technical tools that are used by platforms. Now, I call this in my work the 4 Ds of content moderation. So the first is deplatforming. That's removing an account or a user off of a platform. Suspension would be a temporary period of deplatforming. The second D would be demonetization. So that's restricting the financial opportunities or avenues for these influencers, such as removing advertising revenue on YouTube for their videos. The third D is deranking. So that would be, for example, restricting the visibility and search results of their content so it may not appear in the first page or 2 of Google, for example. And then the fourth D is detection. And this is arguably the most complicated content moderation tool, and that's using both humans and automated machine learning to detect content that violates a platform's community guidelines. Now, the examples I show on the screen are the ways in which we see these influencers circumvent these content moderation efforts. For example, on the left-hand side, an Instagram story in which Robin proclaims the ways in which the Kufer jab, that's the COVID vaccine, could affect female and male fertility. This is all a plan to reduce the population via widespread sterilization. So spreading conspiracy theories or like the Great Replacement in combination with scientific disinformation about vaccines. But Robin also writes, Bill Gates is spearheading the push for mandatory vaccination. Now, some of you might see that vaccination there is manipulated in its spelling using different characters instead of the word. And some of you might remember that during the pandemic, Instagram introduced a feature on posts containing words like vaccine, COVID, corona, in which a pop-up banner would appear that would direct users to the World Health Organization's official page about the COVID pandemic. Now, very early on, these influencers spotted that, and so they were finding ways to circumvent the flagging of their content through these creative means. On the other hand, sometimes we see false positives come into play when it comes to content moderation. So on the right-hand side, this was a reaction to a photo that Robin had posted of a vacuum that she had bought for her household. Now, for some reason, we don't know why, Instagram flagged this as vaccine in its system. So she says, Dane, the algorithm is paranoid. It thinks any word that starts with a V is a dog whistle for jabs. LMAO. The truth is, we don't know why this post was flagged. Was it because Robin had already been on Instagram's radar for spreading scientific disinformation, and so they were tracking her account for any suspicious activity? Or was it just simply an error in the machine learning system? We don't know, and actually that is a bigger issue. There's not a lot of transparency around how these decisions are being made. But at other times, particularly with these women, I would argue that there is a particular gender blind spot when it comes towards moderating them. What you see pictured is a photo on the left-hand side from Brittany Zellner's Instagram account, and she covers her husband's face with an Austrian flag emoji. Brittany is prohibited from showing photos of Martin Zellner on her Instagram page because he has been banned from almost every platform imaginable. He does have a Twitter account now that he bought, but leave that aside. She posts the exact same photo on her Telegram account, undoctored, unfiltered. Now, there's very clearly a cross-platform posting phenomenon that's happening here, but more so, Brittany is a member of the same organization as her husband, has faced legal prosecution for her activism, and has been denied entry at country borders. But unlike her husband, she does not directly violate platform's community guidelines because she doesn't directly incite violence like he does. So she's very good at sort of being adaptable and skirting the boundaries of what is and what is not accepted on these platforms, and thus she's allowed to continue to post accordingly. But in addition to content moderation, there are some softer approaches that can be taken online. First and foremost is, of course, improving digital and media literacy in combination, importantly, with critical thinking skills. And I should flag here that it doesn't really matter what age you are. It doesn't matter if you're a young social media user or an older one. Everybody can benefit from digital literacy skills in combination with critical thinking. How is your information being presented? Are you questioning it as credible, etc.? But in studying this space, and going back to what I said earlier about influencer culture and understanding how influencers engage with audiences, there is, I think, a lot of potential in thinking about the role that counter-influencers can play in this regard. Some of the examples you see there on the screen, such as Frau Lorenz, a TikTok user on the left-hand side. She creates series in which she shares and educates her followers about, for example, symbols, Nazi symbols on social media that you might have missed, and kind of explains them. Or Abby Richards in the middle, who creates content about conspiracy theories and about disinformation and various manipulative tactics that influencers use. Or Ashley Taylor on the right-hand side, who creates a lot of satirical content about tradwives and points out the hypocrisy in their content. Now, when we think about counter-influencers, we should also bear in mind what is their motivation for posting this content. What is their ideology? Does it inform the way that they create content? What are the strategies that they will leverage for audience engagement? And then what are potentially the risks if you were to say, invite them to participate in things like interventions? And above all, what the research does tell us is that if you are going to be using counter-influencers in this way, you have to allow them to maintain credibility by having control over the creative process. Because once you start dictating to them what they can and cannot include, that is no longer seen as authentic and as credible to their followers. So I will leave it with a couple of final thoughts to summarize. So the first is I've shown how far-right activists are using influencer practices and networked intimacy as effective recruitment, radicalization, and propaganda strategies. But in doing so, these far-right influencers, they are posting what we might broadly think of as apolitical lifestyle content, right? So they're posting about self-help and self-improvement. They're posting about food vlogging or health and wellness advice. And this type of apolitical lifestyle content, it is purposeful as a way to relate and appeal to broad audiences. At the same time, these influencers are using coded language within that apolitical lifestyle content to then advance their ideology, and they are simultaneously benefiting from algorithms and the visibility and posting what is just broadly lifestyle. And finally, just to repeat myself from earlier, that the propaganda and marketing of far-right women plays a key function, and that is above all to normalize and to legitimize far-right ideology for mainstream appeal. Thanks very much, and looking forward to the discussion and questions.
Great. All right. Thank you, Eviane, for this, well, both wonderful and slightly disturbing look into this online space. And I certainly want to get a little bit more into some of the things that we've seen. But maybe to start with, it's maybe good to also look at the real world politics for a bit, because I'm quite curious. You've told us a lot about the way that all this online content can be very political. And Andrej, you research populism and political parties, and I was wondering, for those of us for whom this seems like there is a bit of a gap between with what we've just seen happening online and the real world politics that we see play out in our own political system. Can you tell us a little bit about how your research sort of lets you look at this, or how it relates to what we've just heard?
Thanks for a very nice presentation, and for as I was listening, I just felt older and older as I realized how little I know about this world. On the other hand, I was sort of thinking about that, right? I was thinking about how this relates to the world that I know more about, and that's sort of conventional politics. And I think that a couple of points. So when I was listening to you talk, I was thinking how this has been a long time now, how the radical right really understands culture and identity. And I would even say better than the left, right? There's this, I'm going to be really esoteric now. There's a left-wing Marxist theorist named Antonio Gramsci. And
here we go diving into it.
Here we go into it. But I mean, very shortly, very to the point, on purpose, in the 1970s and the 1980s, the right in France, and you mentioned in your book, they took this over. Right? And they understand the power of culture, right? And identity. And so, I mean, what you're talking about is, I think, is super interesting, and we can talk more about that. And I was thinking, so during the last, and just to give an example of this, and I give a male example. I was thinking of, and I'm so bad with names now. I looked it up and then I forgot his name again. But the young leader of the French National Front right now, and maybe Chita, you can look it up for me. He's got an Italian name, but he's French. And the interesting thing is, during the campaign, he was doing exactly this with image, right? He didn't say anything. He was just appearing and being right wing and being cool. Right, making right wing be cool again. I mean, so again, this is super interesting. Baradel, yeah, exactly. So this is something that's very interesting. And I'll make one more point, and then I'll stop. I think the other thing that you really pointed out that I think is absolutely fascinating is the last couple of slides when you're talking about the international links, right? So as you were talking, I was kind of thinking, okay, so tangibly, what does this have to do with actual voting behavior? And I think it does have something to do with voting behavior, but I don't think we're not talking about millions of people voting for these parties. But then I was thinking, well, the really clever thing that's going on,
aren't we? Because
we can talk about that. I mean, I'm turning in terms of gender. Right. Okay, we can talk about how many women are they turning. I mean, we can talk about that. But I think that one of the things that's really fascinating is these women are building platforms for themselves to then become influenced with parties, right? And I think that what you mentioned, because this is another trend that we're seeing that this international network, and you're talking about the gender aspect of it, is having an important influence on transforming how these parties are thinking about politics. And let me just say one thing, and then I will stop, is they're moving beyond this idea that it's only about migration, right? They're now constructing an alternative form of conservatism, anti-wokeism, and gender plays a huge role in this. Mentioning CPAC, right? Things like CPAC, these things are really important, and they're creating these links between these parties. So you had slides of Meloni and Fox in Spain. So this is another way I think that they're having an influence.
Yeah, and I think somewhere it was also mentioned that these spaces also very much normalized these anti-democratic ideas or anti-democratic tendencies. And I was thinking, how is it different from when it comes from a place where women do it, from when it's a place where men do it? Is there a different dynamic going on there, or is it basically the same? And do we just always underestimate it when women do it? Not sure if it's a question that's answerable.
Yeah, it's a hard first question. No.
Sorry, it's my job.
I mean, we can certainly see it in the way that they are framing issues of gendered insecurity and safety, right? So, for example, when they're talking about motherhood being something that should be protected and sanctified, and then spreading these things like anti-vax conspiracy theories because it is seen as a direct threat to reproduction and to the female body. And I think it's the fact that these narratives can be so successful because they are also playing off of people's vulnerabilities and insecurities in general. So one reason why I think a lot of this scientific disinformation that these far-right women influencers spread is successful is because of the fact that for so long, the medical establishment has very much neglected women's experiences in terms of the way that they have been systematically understudied in reactions to things like medicines, etc., and not, taking their experiences into account. So because of this inherent vulnerability, these far-right women are then able to sort of weaponize that fear and that insecurity in spreading their narrative.
They sort of filled that gap that was there, and women are like, finally, somebody is hearing that I'm having doubts and I'm fearful about some medical.
It's that, but it's also advancing their ideology in ways that, again, are very relatable and everyday, right? So like the men within the far right, these women are also offering political commentary on YouTube or reacting to current events, just like their male counterparts. But they are also posting about cooking dinner for their families and thinking about what are the ingredients that they're choosing for their dinner, or they'll be posting about gardening with their children, right? So that's I think one of the initial entry points which led me to be interested in wanting to understand why are these women choosing to showcase a more holistic representation of themselves and doing so in ways that also represent their political views.
But is this new for the alt-right, or not the alt-right, the far-right, or is this simply a new form of the same type of content? Or,
well, I wouldn't say that it's new, but it's a lot more visible and exposed than what we have seen in the past. Because in the past, it tended to be more secluded and women sort of relegated behind the scenes in this type of activity. But I would argue that the visibility of their prominence is something that's new.
When you say that, you're talking about women in general, in the far right, yeah. No, I would agree. No, I can't disagree with what you're saying. I agree, but I think that when I was watching your presentation, I was thinking just the really clever thing that they're doing, and this is a little bit with your question, Pam, is that it's in the similar vein of the far right, is this appeal to authenticity, which is just really clever, right? I mean,
what makes it so clever?
Well, because it's the ability to come across as just somebody normal, just somebody average, just somebody everyday, right? That's one thing that's really incredibly, I think, and it's also what you said as well. It's the politicization of the personal. right? And this is something the left used to do, but the left doesn't do it as much anymore. I was just talking to some students here, talked about this in my class, right? The personalization of the politicization of the personal was what the left used to do. But now the right has taken us over in this way, right? So what you said, what you eat, what you drink, how you feel, right? And I think it speaks to people, right? And this is where I am a little bit, I am a little bit more critical in the sense that I wouldn't sell it as a false consciousness, right? I mean, that's where I think we have to be careful, right? I mean, I think we and then we're using these terms like radicalization, and I think we should, but I think we have to also be careful because, I mean, in order to understand the phenomena as well, I mean, it's speaking to something that speaks to their everyday lives, right?
How did this shift happen, though, between...
I don't think it happened. What is right?
No, the shift that you mentioned a couple of sentences ago between the left used to also do this, like, personalized...
I'm sorry, but I mean, because the right is just much smarter at understanding identities right now. I mean, it's not a popular thing, but I mean, it's the truth. I mean, I really think I'm becoming more and more that politics is about identity, and the right understands identities much better.
The left used to do this as well, but stopped.
They don't. The left does not want to present itself as in the same way. I mean, I'm making pretty exaggerated statements, but I mean, if I watch what you're doing and I watch what the right is doing, right? I mean, I think that they understand this idea that they're speaking to people with it makes sense to them, right? I mean, it has to, right? You cannot purely manufacture this. I mean, it's a give and take. There's a supply and a demand, right? I mean, they're speaking to people's grievances, right? I mean, yeah, we have to admit that, right? I mean, these are not maybe not our answers but we have to admit that these are their grievances, right? And it becomes there is a radicalization, but you don't just radicalize from nowhere, right? People have to be open to this in some sense, right? It has to speak to them. You could disagree.
I mean, would you say that there is a potential on the left, or the more extreme left, maybe? Let me phrase it differently. Okay. Is there something about this type of content and this type of political discourse that is inherent to the far right, or is there a way for the left to sort of adapt to this and sort of make this their own as well? And should they?
What do you mean by the inherent?
I mean, should we be looking for an equivalent of this type of online space on the left?
There is actually a somewhat equivalent space in it on the left that at the peak of the alt-right, they called it BreadTube. And that sort of has amorphized into a various network of different leftist YouTubers and streamers, etc. But it does go back to Andrej's point about the focus of conversation so far has really just been about politics and reactionary takes on politics, and not so much on sort of the lifestyle aspects that we have seen the right capitalize on and really promote in terms of this identity politics, metapolitical agenda. But of course, there are left-wing populists that are quite prominent too. Like we look at a figure like AOC, for example, but it's not as prevalent in the same way.
You look like...
Yeah, I want to say something, yeah. I'm just thinking,
before I switch to another point.
Just thinking, does the left come online and say, I'm a proud multiculturalist? I identify
it's not cool.
It's not cool, huh?
No.
I identify myself as a multiculturalist. That's my identity. That's who I am. Right? Speaking to this, to the society of people that feel like our society should be diverse and liberal. Oh my God.
But I feel like there's also this sense of prosecution, right? Like they're coming for our fertility, they're coming for our kids, they're coming for our femininity. And just saying I'm a proud multiculturalist.
Well, exactly. You have to figure out how to say it, right? You have to figure out how to do it, right?
Like, would that work?
I'm not the consultant, yeah.
Anyway, I was curious. you were telling us about the success that these women have, but also the kind of critiques that they get, and that got me thinking about sexism and the role that sexism plays in both the success and the critique that these women receive. Like, could you tell us a little bit about how you look at that?
Yeah, it's a great question because it's a double-edged sword in some ways. So these women definitely capitalize off of their looks and youth in order to promote their messaging. And then they play upon these very stereotypical representations of femininity to do so. But I would like to make clear that these women are not universally adored by everybody in the far right. I mean, they do face quite a sustained amount of sexism and misogyny within the movement. And I would notice this when I was, for example, watching live streams, and I would see in the live chat bar the type of comments that they were receiving, things like, just shut up and go back to the kitchen, things like that.
Classic.
Yeah. And then the way that they would deal with this by just trying to make emasculating comments or saying this type of behavior won't be tolerated, we're just going to kick you off the live stream, chat, etc. For a very long time, these women were also labeled as trad thoughts.
Trad what?
Trad thought. So we're going deep into internet culture now. But it's essentially a woman who promotes traditional values but doesn't actually live them in her daily life. So for a very long time, before several of these women had gotten married and started families, they were called trad thoughts because they were just monetizing off of their traditionalist talking points. But yes, so point being, you know, the type of sexism and misogyny they face, it is very prevalent and they're not universally accepted. But then the way that these women will defend themselves is against such attacks. And let's bear in mind that this is a very male-dominated field. And so these women are highly visible because there are so few of them that are so prominently featured, is that they will tend to exceptionalize themselves. So they will say, well, if I don't speak out, who else will? And so they tend to promote their own positioning as being spokespersons. And I noticed this, for example, when a couple of women I studied, they had left the scene, disappeared, and come back again. And then I think another one also left and came back again a second time. And they would, every time they would have these comeback videos, they will say things like, well, God gave me this platform. It would be a shame not to use it to spread the message, right? Once again, exceptionalizing themselves. But to me, that signaled, okay, there is an element of opportunism here in which they enjoy the attention and visibility of their platform. Because again, there are so few prominent female spokespersons.
What's so interesting, what you're saying is pretty much the same dynamic that I witnessed, or that you witness with male populist leaders, right? This kind of idea of being one of the people, but just being a little bit better, you know, sort of being almost having to do your duty to save the people. This kind of what you said, exceptionalism, right? So
if not me, who will do it?
Yeah, I mean, you're one of the people, but you're just a little bit better, right? It's just a little bit up there because you're just, you know. And this is that ability to connect, that authenticity that you need to have, but you also have to be just a step higher to have that sort of charisma or whatever.
But isn't this also a critique that the left often receives, that they come across as elitist and as sort of knowing better than thou?
That's what they can't do. They don't do that. I mean, they don't really come across as elitist. They just come across as being there to represent the people. So, I mean, in some sense, that's what you're showing there. I think it's really nicely, right? I mean, they're female populists, right? In the kitchen, right? I mean, doing their videos, right? I mean, it's amazing, right? I mean, yeah, sorry.
Not sure what your algorithm looks like.
I mean, but
just kidding.
So the interesting thing, though, is that I do want to mention one thing. And you said to me about when I said, you know, how many women are they mobilizing, right? So I was thinking about that today, and I was looking at some of the sort of the numbers a little bit in terms of voting, right? So for the longest time, these parties were considered to be male parties, right? And for the longest time, this was a puzzle that political scientists tried to figure out. Why are these male parties, right? And I think there is a slow change. There is a slow change, and in some countries where you see female leaders, you see that there's a small change. And also when the parties get larger, there's just there's also a change as well. They still are male parties, right? I mean, this is. I mean, there is a change, but if you look at this, right? I mean, we know that right-wing parties have more men anyway, but and I was looking at some of the data in the Netherlands and in other countries. I mean, they still are male parties, right? So we have to be careful. This is not the feminization of these parties, right? And you're not saying that. I know you're not, but I mean, in that sense, right? So again, what's the electoral process that's going on here?
I mean, if I remember correctly from the elections in the U.S., there was this overwhelming demographic of mostly men who voted for Trump, with one notable exception within like white women who were slightly older.
You would know the American better than me.
I'm not sure if that's...
I'm not particularly sure about the age, but definitely a shift in white suburban women who leaned toward Trump increased subsequently from 2016, 2020, 2024.
That does seem weird to me, because that's not the type of people I would expect to be very deep in like online right-wing spaces. But maybe I'm wrong there.
I don't think you're necessarily wrong. I mean, this has been a trend in the US that has been tracking for some time, so it's not necessarily abnormal to see also women who, as they age, tend to shift more conservative in their voting behavior. Now, that said, if we look at just Trumpism and the MAGA movement as a whole, I mean, I think the influencers that I've looked at in my study, they are perhaps just a sliver of what is a really broad spectrum of the MAGA movement in general. That said, I mean, I think there's still some data coming out in terms of what motivated certain types of voters to vote the way they did. Like, for example, in the US, abortion was such a strong ballot issue this cycle, and it definitely motivated women to vote more than men. But if we are going to look down at the breakdown, I mean, we know, for example, that things like the economy and immigration were the top drivers in support for Trump. And I think particularly for suburban women, that might have been a bigger issue than perhaps other issues on the ballot, other social justice issues on the ballot. But again, I think that evidence is still coming in.
Do you know? Yeah. Are there any studies, or is there any data on these women that you're talking about that are following, or the people that are following these women, and do they even vote? I mean, I would imagine a lot of them don't even vote.
So younger people do not vote as much. We know that to be true. I think this election, the statistics were interesting in the fact that of Gen Z who did vote, so these are people who might have voted for the very first time in a U.S. presidential election. What has been interesting is to see a very big gender split with Gen Z voters. So we tend to see female voters lean much more progressive on issues, and then we're tending to see younger male voters lean much more conservative. And I think when we're talking about the appeal of these female influencers, one thing to bear in mind is, yes, I think they're speaking to young men, and this is also in combination with manfluencers like Tate and the entire manosphere ecosystem, where we're seeing both sides that are appealing to young men and sort of spreading these deeply misogynistic views, right? So I think that attributes for part of that gender split.
So you would say what we're seeing is definitely not a sort of resistance from the right to patriarchy, because I've sometimes heard it being described this way, right? These are women who are very influential, who are gaining a lot of power and influence by doing this, and sort of establishing themselves as these powerful people. So you could argue, like, hey, this is sort of a way to counter a very male-dominated space from the right. But if I understand you correctly, that's not at all the way to look at it.
But they're still supporting patriarchal values and viewpoints, right? So,
Yeah.
I mean, and I think that's one of the biggest irony in terms of studying these women is that they are vehemently anti-feminist. At the same time, they benefit greatly from the advances of feminism and women's rights movements. For example, like almost all these women attended university, they write books, they own bank accounts. That's where they receive their sponsored
Except if you're really deep into the tradwives community.
Except if you're really deep. They own property. I mean, they vote. It's interesting because increasingly I'm seeing this shift towards trying to end women's suffrage as a talking point within these far-right female-dominated circles. They believe that the man as the head of the household should cast a vote on behalf of the entire household, for example. But taking that aside, these women that I studied, they do benefit from feminism. Now, that said, I doubt many of them have actually read any theories about feminism. I think they tend to take a very superficial representation of what feminism is, and it's often this kind of reaction to girl boss feminism or that kind of boss babe feminism. But if these women actually knew their feminist theory, then they would know, for example, that there has been support within feminist movements to try to recognize domestic work, as labor, right? But I think they have a very superficial understanding of what feminism is, despite the fact that they benefit from it.
Right, right. So before I want to move on to the audience, because I can imagine there is a lot of questions in there as well, I do want to talk about the countermeasures that you mentioned at the end of your talk, or like a way to counter these very big influencers. Because what I was thinking, I couldn't help but thinking when I was listening to it, is that the 4 Ds that you mentioned are all about content moderation. And I can't help but think that this type of content moderation may be part of the reason why the right has become, or like the far right has become as extreme and as big as it is, because it might strengthen this idea of being prosecuted, right? We can't even say anything anymore. Like, we're constantly being censored, we're constantly being silenced, all these words that you hear. And how do you make sure that you moderate without further radicalizing people who look at this and people who are into this space?
So one thing we should bear in mind is that the far right will always claim victimhood, right? So it doesn't really matter what particular action you take. Yeah. And that's just part of the reactionary stance, right? This claim that society is changing too quickly and we need to preserve and to conserve, right? Now, specifically when it comes to content moderation, we need to be asking ourselves a couple of core questions. The first is, if you are trying to deplatform somebody, what do you hope to be your goal? Like, what are you trying to achieve by that? And the way that I study these mainstream platforms is that these are platforms to provide exposure and visibility. So when I think about the effects of deplatforming, it's about restricting that amplification to larger audiences on these platforms.
But who gets to decide that, though? Like, don't you run the risk of becoming the anti-democratic tendency that you want to combat?
Platforms are not neutral, right? Platforms are for profit, and they profit off of hate. And I mean, this has been well documented. So I think when we have conversations about free speech, we need to bear in mind that these are systems that have been designed to garner your attention and to sort of keep you constantly online.
Why you get what happens at X right now with Elon Musk.
Yes. You have the Musk effect. There has been some really interesting studies that look at what happens when far-right users are deplatformed. So one study I'm thinking about is by Richard Rodder's team at University of Amsterdam. And they followed a number of what they called Twitter celebrities who had been deplatformed that migrated to Telegram. And there was actually a really interesting finding from that study, because you would assume, okay, if you're deplatforming these people, they're going to get even more siloed into their echo chambers on Telegram. And really interestingly, they found the opposite effect. So they actually found that when these users migrated to Telegram, their violent rhetoric decreased. And you might think, okay, that's a bit strange. Why would that happen? And the main reason for that is when they were on Twitter, they were constantly engaging in arguments with the political left, right? They were constantly in these antagonistic interactions. And then when they migrated to Telegram, they didn't have an enemy to provoke anymore. So actually their rhetoric shifted towards being a lot more focused on the community building. But I do want to gauge from the audience, how many of you are active on more than one social media platform? Okay, so that is most people. That's most people. And I would say it's the same thing for these influencers or any other type of social media user. I mean, it's very rare that we'll find one person who, or rather, it's very rare we'll find somebody who's active on only one platform. And that's the same way that these influencers and activists and users are also using these platforms. They know that different platforms have different purposes. So if you're on Instagram, you're trying to reach a large audience. If you're on Telegram, you're already amongst a group of other users who are radicalized, and you're just building that type of in-group identity and community building.